Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Marvin Baumann. This is the third episode in my tautology video series. This time on the topic of what I call the emptiness of the physical universe and of human religions. And this will be, again, as the perception lecture before in episode 2, a really foundational episode for what is to come. Because here for the first time I will be talking about how tautologies arise. Tautologies are the main theme of this series, the main concept I want to present to you guys. And I will be talking about how they arise and how they serve as anchors to our worldviews, and by virtue of that also as anchors to our psychology, giving us also sort of a direction and even a sort of meaning in life. So that will be the topic in this lecture. So let's start and jump right into it. Now, first off, I want to set the stage and really generally talk about this point of why do we need to ask why in our life, and why is what I call philosophical psychological stability necessary and crucial to have a good life. And remember from the prior lecture, having a good life is the main theme of this lecture, and the main theme, I guess, of life in general. So first things first, you cannot have a good life if you are unstable, right? We know life inherently is unstable. Life is a whole bunch of up and down, and we tend to be bombarded by all sorts of outside influences, and life can tend to be at times this sort of roller coaster. And if we are not anchored to something, if we don't have some sort of point of reference that gives us some sort of direction, we are just thrown about by life like some plastic cup in the ocean, and it pushes over here, pushes over there, and that's not how you can have a good life, because that means you're sort of a victim to outside circumstances, and just the arbitrariness and the randomness of life and enforces itself onto you, and there's no way you can have a good life this way. So stability is essential, stability is key, and to get this stability we need this sort of anchor. In German I call this Halt, and this roughly translates something you can hold on to, and also implies something that's firm, something that's solid. So we need something where we can grasp ourselves to, and which gives us the stability up on which we can then construct our stable and our good life. And this anchor, this Halt, we will come to see that not only will it give us the stability, but also through being a point of reference, it will give us direction, because it will imply, it will be sort of a heuristic we have in the back of our minds all the time, that leads us in our life and tells us, okay, this might be a good idea, this might be a bad idea. So with this out of the way, we can now start to ask this very basic question. All right, where should we anchor ourselves to? And that is to say, on what basis, on what foundation can we place our life, ourselves, and the decisions we're taking in life, right? So very much here I have this image of your life is this sort of a house you want to build, and you build your house on some sort of ground, but the ground is made of sand. So if you just are going to, and the sand is just, if you just naively were to build your house, so you just naively live and you believe and think and feel and pursue whatever just happens to be what you feel and think and pursue at the moment, this is to build your house on sand, which would mean that just with the first start of the rain, the sand will slowly go away, and your house will be rocky and your house will crash. So the idea is, okay, we want to drill down, we want to dig down, and we need something that is solid. We need Halt. We need something that gives us this hold, that gives us this foundation, on top of which we can then construct our house, our life, our psyche, right? So just keep this this metaphor, this image in the back of your brain. So this anchor this implies the idea also of what gives us direction, and also what informs and validates and reassures our worldview and our self-image, our feelings, our goals. Okay, so now to find this anchor, it is essential to ask why. This is really general. Okay, so this means that whatever you think right now, whatever you feel right now, whatever you think you believe, right, whatever you trust in right now, you always need to ask why. Why do I feel this way? Why is this important to me? Why do I want to pursue this sort of goal, right? So asking why is essential. And the thing about this is, if you cannot give a convincing answer, a solid answer to this why, or as often is the case, if you refuse to give an answer, or if you even say, if you're in denial about needing to ask why, if you say, why should I ask why? I don't care, like, that's just what I want. That's just what I want. That's just what I feel. That's just what's important to me. I don't need to ask why. That means you're necessarily on unstable ground, because you are not willing to investigate what's underneath your house right now. And chances are, and actually in some way I feel like it's guaranteed, that underneath your house is sand, and sand will just wash away with the first rain. So you need to ask why, because instability makes a good life impossible. And if you have not confirmed the solidity of your beliefs, your worldview, and your sort of life plan, how do you know that you won't fail and crash and burn at some point in the future that might be quite soon? You cannot know. You don't know, because you haven't investigated it. You have not asked why. So we have to assume that you are unstable, which also means it's impossible to have a good life for you. So that's why we need to ask why. And that's just because if you're in denial about asking why, that means you just accept whatever it is you just happen to believe and feel to be true in this moment. And to think this is, to me, ridiculous, because there's some sort of process that preceded you now feeling and thinking and believing and pursuing what you're currently doing. And this might be your upbringing, this might be something else, this might be some experiences, but we are talking about our life, and we're talking about living a good life. And your life is literally the most important thing there is. So we're not going to gamble on this arbitrary process that produced your current beliefs, your current thoughts and feelings and goals. We're not gambling on this being magically, automatically the correct thing. Because chances are high that it's unstable, that it's actually, at least to some degree, incorrect. Now, if we now start asking why, we quickly find that asking why implies a sort of recursivity. So recursivity, what does this mean? Recursivity is something sort of that feeds itself, that calls itself. In programming languages, is sort of a function that calls itself. And in this context, it's just whatever you answer when you ask yourself why, you can then take this answer and then ask why yet again. So you might say, okay, this is important to me. Then you ask yourself, why is this important to you? Then you come up with some answer. Okay, that's the reason, blah, 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 blah. But then you can again say, okay, but why should that be the reason? Why is that the reason? How did you come to this belief, to this point? So again, you're thinking, and again, you're answering. Okay, probably it's this reason, that reason. And then you say, all right, good. But why? Why should this be the reason? And you see, like, you can ask this why again and again and again, all the way down. And this directly implies that to stop at some point, to come to something solid that cannot be undermined again with a new why, we need to get to some sort of foundational truth, or existential truth if you like, which is then something we could hold on to. because it's not undermined by the next why, but why, but why, but why. Asking why is important because it analyzes whether we are on solid ground or whether we are on sand. But also necessarily its analysis is subversive. It dissolves that which it analyzes. So it's destructive in this way, but also it's necessary, because not asking why is also not an option, because then necessarily you have to assume you're unstable, you are not on solid ground, since you have not investigated it, and since you have not specifically found that it is solid, and this precludes you from having a good life. So we need to ask why, and we need to find this sort of foundational truth which can serve as this anchor, which can give us this halt, this thing to hold on to. And this foundational truth will then also give us direction, as I mentioned, and it will serve as a sort of metric or a yardstick. And the reason it's important to be a yardstick is because this will then mean you can now make decisions in accordance with this foundational truth. Because now you have some sort of decision and you have several options, and your anchor will now serve as a yardstick, and you measure all your options, and then you will take the best one in relation to this measure. So in that way, the anchor does provide orientation, direction, and stability in your life, right? Now, having understood that we are searching for this sort of foundational truth, for this thing we can anchor to, where could we look to find such a truth? Now, historically, this truth was found in religions and myths and sagas and so on. And religion, they conveyed some sort of worldview which was more or less coherent, and they claimed to have some sort of existential truth. So they told a story, and they said this story contains existential truth, foundational truth, something we can hold on to, something that is true in the most absolute solid sense of the word. And so potentially we could look to religions, we could investigate religions, so maybe we can find something there. Something else we could do is we could look out into the universe, look out into the world, and sort of see, okay, maybe there's something foundational, something so absolutely true that's also relevant to us as human beings, which we can then use as the foundation to build on our life onto, right? So we can look into physics, we can look into the universe, we can look into how human beings came to be through the process of evolution, to maybe find some sort of foundational truth in the material world out there, or in the mechanics of how the universe works, and so on. And just to put the conclusion first, in my studies of religion and physics, and I will outline this shortly in the next chapters, I came to the conclusion that both religion and the universe, let's say, are empty of this sort of foundational truth which we would need as humans. And this emptiness of both means they serve as merely unstable foundations, or they are not usable as something to build onto, right? So that's honestly unfortunate, but to me it seems that the universe and human religions are empty of the type of absolute truth, of the type of foundation we would need to have a stable life. So let me try to explain why I say this and what I mean by this. So let's first jump into religion. It's clear, I believe, to most, that religions are as old as human culture. And actually, religions tended to be not separable from culture. Religion also tends to have some content which is helpful, which guides you and which gives you some direction. That's why people have religion. That's why it was useful all these thousands of years. Right. So there's certainly some value in religions, but the fact that religions and this sort of collectively exercised practice, which religions do sociologically, the fact that this is helpful, the fact that this contains and propagates some sort of experience which is passed on through generation and generation, and which is layered into, I would say, a thick morass of superstitious beliefs as well. Just because there's something that's useful in there does not mean that religions necessarily contain a deeper truth, something that goes beyond and deeper and is more foundational than just experiences that humans made and written down and expressed in some sort of stories and told to their children and to their grandchildren over the generations. So that there's not a priori an assumption that religions would contain foundational truths just by virtue of them being helpful some of the time. And also we know that since humans themselves are not sources of such foundational truth, religions which are purely man-made, so we will now investigate this a bit, and if we find that religions are purely man-made, if just religions are nothing else than stories being told from human to human and throughout the centuries, that means that religions are a bad anchor, because they are based on nothing more than human experience, opinion, and even superstition. And human experience is certainly nice and certainly helpful, but it's not foundational truth, right? Of the sort of the absolute solidness, solidity, strength which we would need. And also, we know that humans are not sources of foundational truth, because if we were, why would human beings have this strong desire of looking outside to find something to hold on to? If you look into the world today, you see all matters of behaviors, whether it's be religions or all matters of behavior, where you can observe people grasping onto something, holding onto something desperately. We're desperate to find something which gives us halt, something that gives us stability. And if we ourselves could be sources of foundational truth, that would be entirely unnecessary. So I think it's a given that humans themselves are not sources of foundational truths, which would then imply if religions are merely products of humans and of a deeply human generation of these religions, then they cannot be sources of foundational truth, and they cannot be a solid anchor. So let's try to understand, how did religions came to be, right? That's what we are trying to understand. If they turn out to be merely human-made, then they are not good enough. So to try to understand this, I want to introduce this concept of what's called syncretism, and just easily it's sort of when you merge different religions or different belief systems, different practices, or you could just say also different sort of cultures, but yeah, different religions. You take different religions and you merge them into some sort of new belief system, and then this becomes a new sort of religion, or just sort of a continuous development of a religion which has infused some external beliefs into it. So that's what syncretism is. Now, with this out of the way, we know that religions have developed organically alongside and undistinguished from other types, other expressions of culture for thousands of years. And the point about this, also really interesting, is that this concept of religion, which we use now today, and which for us is such a distinguished concept, and with culture being a more broad sort of term, this has only been used since the 16th and 17th centuries. Before that, we did not clearly separate, and we didn't have any conception of religion beyond other types of cultural practices and beliefs. So some sort of belief in the supernatural was just as much part of some sort of ethnic culture than whatever clothes you wear, whatever spices you eat, right? So this is again now a topic of perception, where now that we have this term of religion, we look at it separately from general culture. But it used to be that religion is basically just a piece of culture. And if that means we have to investigate how did cultures evolve, to also, by virtue of that, understand how did religions evolve. And I presume it's relatively easy for everyone to imagine that and accept that cultures evolved organically over the years, over the millennia. And so either you have different examples of sort of isolated cultures, which they didn't remain static, but they actually had this tendency to intensify and deepen over the years. And just some easy examples is, for example, if you look at Japanese culture, you can find these elements of Japanese culture, for example, the tea ceremonies, which today, or which sort of are so elaborate and so deep and so specific, which we just do not know in certainly in Western culture, and this probably started out in a light way, and then just people improved upon it and had more and more increasing depth of this piece of cultural behavior. And another interesting example is the example of Easter Island. And Easter Island, if you remember, Easter Island is this island where they have these sort of stone heads, and this is one of the, let's say, defining cultural traits of Easter Island, of the cultures of the Easter Islands. Used to have these different tribes, but they shared sort of a broad general culture, and in this culture, the tribal leaders would have enormous status and doubt on them if they can manage to generate like these huge human head statues made of stone, and it's actually a particular type of stone. And Easter Island is totally isolated in the Pacific Ocean, so there's sort of a perfect case for an isolated culture, and they actually intensified their culture to such a degree that they endangered the subsistence of their own living, and they actually died out, maybe from different reasons, but certainly one reason for this is that they used to mine these stones, and to move those stones around the island, and to work the stones, you would need to have logs of trees which you can roll the stone on top of. And the production of these sort of statues grew to such a degree because you can imagine the different tribal leaders, they were in a sort of status competition amongst each other. So they all wanted to create more and more of these statues. So that's certainly not the whole story, but that's certainly also a really interesting and true piece of the story. So they were striving to build more and more of these moai statues, and over the years, over the centuries, they actually completely used up or killed off all of their forests, up to some point where at some point they did not have really any trees left. And trees are necessary to build boats, which they can use to fish. So actually they struggled, and they eventually died out, because, I mean, at least that's one of the let's say historical theories. They died out because they couldn't feed themselves anymore, because there was no forest left which they could use to build ships, and which they could then use to build boats. So that's an extreme example of how isolated cultures tend to intensify, tend to deepen, and sometimes this can lead to a downfall. But in general, this means that cultures, they are not static. They don't remain the same over the years. They evolve in some way. And if they're isolated, they tend to deepen, they tend to double down on what they're already doing, and tend to become more and more proficient in exactly what they are doing. But certainly the more relevant case is the case of clashing and mixing and merging and competition between different cultural and ethnic groups. Because most groups are not isolated. Most groups have neighbors all around them who have different beliefs, who might have different ethnicities, a different culture, a different way of looking at the world. And so this clashing and this mixing happened all the time in human history. That is the story of human history. And this, whenever cultures used to clash, and sometimes the culture would be wiped out, sometimes the culture would be sort of merged or partially integrated or forced upon, but not totally forced on another culture. So this led to relatively rapid changes in cultures. And most importantly, most interestingly, the invention of new parts of cultures and also loss of others. And this is sort of this process of syncretism, where different cultures, whatever the prior process was, let's just say they believe something and they have a certain way of doing something and they have some sort of special days or special practices or something, and they clash, and then they might, take something from the other ones, and this would lead to new culture, and by virtue of this also would lead to new and a developed religion. So yes, we know that religious beliefs and practices, they are part of exactly the same type of evolution, of cultural evolution. So that's basically how religions develop, right? And just to give you some examples to make this more tangible for you, and I'm certainly not an expert in syncretism and religious, anthropomorphic development, but just some sort of idea, and you can look this up then more closely yourselves. I'd encourage you to do that. Of these sorts of syncretisms and these sorts of which serve as an example of how religion actually just emerged from this process of intermingling societies and development of thought and practice and so on. So just to give you some examples. So for example, there's the Germanic Roman syncretism, where you would have the Roman Empire and you would have barbarian Germanic tribes to the north of the Limes, the big wall. And the Germans, the ancient Germans, let's say, they took on many of the cultural traits of Romans. Through the process of trade, they would import not only products but also beliefs and practices. And this also went the other way around in a way during the Christianization of sort of the German cultural realm during the Middle Ages. So this sort of cultural realm wasn't just Christian like this, but it sort of diffused through this cultural area. And by this, actually, Christianity itself changed. And we can see this in the holidays we have today in Christianity. Let's just say Easter and Christmas. And both of those actually have their ground in barbarian, tribal, pagan, Germanic, or whatever you want to call it, holidays, which existed way, way, way before Christianity. And they originally they were not part of Christianity, and it's not like Jesus or Paulus or whatever, or Paul would say, okay, like Christianity, you have the tree, and I don't know, on Easter you have like the Easter bunny and you have the Easter eggs, and it's on this date, and so on. No, actually, Easter, for example, used to be, as far as I know, sort of a day, or just sort of a time in during the seasons, which would praise the coming of the summer and sort of the harvest and so and all this sort of thing. And Easter, with the rebirth of Christ, was imposed upon this day. But so you see, there's sort of this merging of prior beliefs and then new beliefs that are introduced in this region. And these sort of things happen all the time. They happen all the time. Another example, I'm not well versed in this, but you can just think of Buddhism developed in Nepal, in Tibet, in India, so this sort of cultural realm, and it expanded eastwards into China and then over to Japan as well. And there it over the centuries, it turned into what we now call Zen Buddhism, which still is Buddhism, but it has a different feel. It's a different sort of thing, and it certainly took on. You can say it was a sinification, meaning it took on Chinese characteristics and likely also Japanese characteristics, I presume, to become a new thing. So it's not like Zen Buddhism just came down from earth, or just this is the truth, because you had Buddhism and then it mixed in some weird way or some nice way with Chinese culture and beliefs that were prior to Buddhism already in the Chinese cultural realm, and this created Zen Buddhism, right? And the next example is just take Christianity itself. What is Christianity? Christianity is a syncretism where you had sort of the pre-Christian Judaism and some sort of teachings of Jesus Christ, which were then mixed into Hellenic culture in general, because Paul and the early apostles, they would not only live in what today is Israel or Palestine, but they would most certainly live in the Hellenic culture, meaning in Greek culture, in ancient Greek culture. And Christianity today is not just sort of based on Judaism, it's also based on Greek culture and Greek ideals, Greek values. So then there again, you see, like, just Christianity wasn't just beamed down from God or whatever and said, like, this is the religion. No, this developed through merging of what existed and what came new into this cultural realm. And to me, maybe most interesting is actually the development of Judaism. All right. So again, I'm not an expert, but I really, really recommend just reading the article on Judaism and the development of Judaism, because there's this perception that Judaism is 5,000 years old, with the implication being it has been how it is today all throughout the 5,000 years. And that's wrong. It's just simply wrong. Because the Judaism of today, which is sort of a rabbinical Judaism, so it's Judaism that's centered on the Torah as a central religious text, and also the Talmud, which is sort of let's just say it's the opinion and interpretation of rabbis, so that's Jewish priests, throughout the centuries of how they interpret the Torah, the central document. And the modern Judaism largely is centered around the Torah, the Talmud, and the authority of the rabbi in the community. So the centrality of the priest and of the text, basically. And rabbinical Judaism developed after Jesus Christ, let's say, or developed out of whatever Judaism was before Christianity. So just taking roughly the year zero as the differentiation, which I think roughly maps onto it, because there was this expulsion of Jewish elites into Babylon, into exile, and the actual, like, the Israelites, the people, they stayed in Israel largely, and they still had sort of their default belief that the prior Judaism, what Judaism was beforehand. And now you had, like, these theistic elites in Babylon, and they were now working on the Torah and developing just the writings, and also there are some expectations that some pieces of the Torah were actually sort of altered to fit things that then happened to Jews, mainly also the expulsion of the elites into Babylon and so on, to just make this whole story more holistic and actually coherent again. And once these elites came back, they then sort of imposed or changed what Judaism was. And Judaism beforehand was Judaism that was centered on the temple and on religious rituals in the side of the temple, and this sort of all these practices and so on. And as far as I understand, also like verbally transmitted beliefs. But then, let's say, just the rabbis came back, just put it simply, and they now say, okay, now central is the text. This is central, and we are the universal interpreters and the authorities on what this text means. And this totally changed Judaism. Of course, like this was preceded by the destruction of the temple. So Judaism just changed because things happened, right? Basically, things happened, it changed. All right, and maybe even more interesting, but then it gets murky because it's even tougher to understand and to investigate this in hindsight for anthropologists and religious historians, or however you call those people, is that Judaism itself, even this temple-centric form of Judaism, this actually emerged from some sort of local folk belief of the Israelites, which were just some, let's say, associated tribes of sheep herders and goat herders and so on, just whatever else. I mean, most of the people were just sort of simple agricultural peoples, and there was some folk belief there. Like most other cultural groups also had folk beliefs, and the interesting thing is that some deep pieces of Judaism seem to have some similarities with some aspects of what we now know of Babylonian and Sumerian and all these sort of ancient religions, right? So, for example, there's the Gilgamesh epos, which, let's just say, emerged out of like the most of our ancient civilizations which we have. So just Sumerian, that's roughly like what we consider the first civilization in terms of the first people who we know of that actually had writing. And so we have some pieces of their myths and of their religion, and there are some interesting similarities there. There are some deep similarities there, which might suggest, we don't know, but since we know later on more concretely how religions tend to merge and transform throughout the ages, if we look back and if we find those similarities, it stands to reason that that some pieces of, for example, Judaism actually emerged or were influenced by prior religions that were also in this general cultural realm of what we now call the Near East or the Middle East. So that's extremely interesting, right? I feel like this is extremely interesting. But what's the implication? The implication is exactly what we feared. Religions are man-made. They are man-made. Religions developed out of a complex process of interacting societies and cultures, intermingling and standing in competition and trade and cooperation and so on. And they are human-made. What the religions exist today and the religions were in the past, they came about through a truly, completely human process. And in that way also they are non-eternal. Other than what religions themselves tell about themselves, they say we are eternal, we are these deep truths. But actually, if you look at how they developed, they are not eternal. They developed. Even if you look at the Bible, 300 after Jesus Christ, some dudes, some guys, sit down in what was then to begin to be the Catholic Church, and they actually chose the books that would be included inside of the Christian Bible and those that wouldn't be included. So we had human beings choosing what's in the holy, godly text and not God. And also, the books they've chosen, who wrote those books? How did those books come about? How did the content inside there, how did the stories inside there come about? Human beings wrote them. And human beings mostly also wrote them based on prior things and new things that came into the mix. So it's this deeply organic process that led to our human religions. But they are exactly that, they are human religions. So they are human-made, they are non-eternal, they are in constant flux and change. And also, if you compare different sorts of religions, most religions contain things which are useful or helpful for human beings. That's why they're passed on. That's why religions survive throughout the centuries. But they stand in contradiction to each other. It's not clear what religion is correct because religions contradict themselves all the time when you compare to them. And all of this leads us to conclude that there is nothing there in religions. There's nothing there beyond just some humans passing on some stories, some opinions, some superstitions, and also some sort of experience and some wisdom that was gleaned from human experience. But there's nothing beyond that. They are empty, that's to say, they are empty of foundational truths. They have no absolute truth which we could cling to, which we could hold on to, which we could say, all right, at least that's stable, at least that's stable. No, since they're human made, it's not stable. It's not absolute. It's not what we need to have halt, to have something to hold on to. Right? And since there's also these contradictions, if we were to choose one religion over the other, that's a completely arbitrary process. So this arbitrariness of choosing one religion over the other, coupled with the fact that all of the religions develop through a deeply human, meaning a flawed, a non-absolute, a non-fundamental process, means there are no solution for us when we need to find this sort of anchor in life, right? This anchor in life that will give us stability and a foundation and direction and orientation and sort of a heuristic to make decisions in our life. Religions cannot serve this because religions are empty of this sort of foundational truth which we would need. All right, so we cannot look for religion to find this anchor. Now, maybe if we understand the world around us, maybe if we look into the universe, maybe there's something out there. Maybe there's something out there which we could look onto, which we could attach to, that would give us the stability, that would give us this orientation. So, let's have a look. Well, before we start, it's really important to say, and this is maybe a bit of a shaky piece of this lecture, is that the argumentation I will apply in this chapter now is itself tautological, because it's based on the tautology of physicalism. And it will become clear in just a moment what I mean by this. And I just want to say that I myself have not been able, as of yet, to undermine this sort of tautology. So the assumption of physicalism, I will define this in just a moment. This assumption of, okay, physicalism is the way of viewing the world, this already implies basically our conclusion. And which means it's tautological, right? It proves itself. So it's a fair criticism in this chapter, but still I believe it is instructive to go through it and just to lay out what does this imply. And also, if you were just to choose a different viewpoint, a different tautology, this would just mean, okay, you swap out physicalism for some other tautology. So you still would have the same criticism, right? So what is physicalism? Physicalism is, here's also the long form definition, is the philosophical view. It's a way of viewing the world, and that says that everything out there, everything is physical. And there's nothing over and above, or there's nothing beyond, there's nothing other than the physical. And physical means all of types of matter, all types of energy, all the physical laws which we know, space and time, and all sorts of physical processes, and then also information and so on, all the physical forces and all the things we nowadays describe using physics and using also other sciences like biology or whatever. Nothing exists beyond the physical. And This is certainly not the only view you could take. There's in philosophical history, I would say the major view is what is called a dualism. Dualism means there is the world of the material, of the physical, and then there's the world of the mind, of the consciousness, or something of that sort. And in some weird way they interact, but we don't quite know how. And yeah, it's this dual nature of the world of reality. But physicalism today, and I don't mean to make an appeal to authority because that's a bad argument, but it's largely the view most scientists have today, which doesn't mean it's true, but I think it is convincing, and I think there's a good argument for why we would accept physicalism for now instead of the alternatives with which we have currently. And the reason for that is, and this goes back to my prior lecture where I talked about epistemology also. So have a look at that chapter if you to remind yourself of this. The fact why physicalism is convincing for now is that if you assume physicalism, this has allowed us many strong explanations of the world, of how things work in the world. So that means we were able to find loads of great scientific theories which were vastly better than any sort of preceding explanation. So we were able to find those explanations about phenomena and dynamics in the world, and we developed them, and it's better than anything that came before. So tentatively, we will now say, okay, they are probably true because they are relatively true. They are truer than what came before. And and now harking back to what I explained in the last lecture, the reason why we know those explanations are better, because those explanations give us power to form and influence these phenomena, which these explanations, which these scientific theories try to explain. And last time we learned that sort of the power we gain by those explanations is in direct proportion to their strength and their potency and their being better than the alternative. And it's just the fact that assuming that there's nothing beyond the physical has allowed us to come up with the last 250 years of scientific history, which has just been phenomenal. And there has never been anything like it in human history, where we've made so much progress and we were able to build also this sort of technology and the sort of wealth and economy built on top of these scientific insights, which were informed by physicalism. So there's just no comparison. So for now, it's clear that physicalism certainly, to me, it seems, based on these arguments, to be the best thing and the best prior assumption we have currently for our view of the world around us and in general the world. And it certainly outperforms the others, because we see if we assume physicalism at every step of the way, we are able to find better explanations than if we were to assume something else. And we know we find better explanations because the explanations we find this way, alternatively to explanations we would derive from dualism or something else, or idealism is the worldview that in dualism you have the material and you have the mental, and idealism is basically you have no material and everything depends on the mental. And if you presuppose dualism or idealism, you cannot derive, or we did not come to all the scientific theories which have allowed us to build the amazing technology and all of the economy we have today. So clearly, I would say it's a superior worldview for now. Okay? So let's just assume for now there's nothing except the physical things, right? And yes, so this was the primary, that it is actually a tautological argument, or it's not really an argument. I will just say, okay, physicalism, I think, is the best assumption we can take today. And now let's try to spell out what this implies. okay, in terms of our quest for finding foundational truth in the universe out there, right? If we look to the stars, is there something we can hold on to? Let's find out. Now, instead of now teaching physics, which you can learn yourself, and I would encourage you to do if you like juggling with formulas, I think it's way more instructive to try to tell a story of how the world works, to bring across to you what I mean by the emptiness of the physical universe. Right. So, just a primer. I studied physics in university and I hold a bachelor's degree. I'm not a PhD level expert, but I believe I have a solid grasp of physics of our world, most parts of it, the major pieces. And I think for myself in this quest so first I studied physics just to understand it, but then I looked into the world, let's say, informed by this understanding, to try to see now, is there something foundational there? Is there some deeper truth which we can actually use in a human way? So in this process, I feel like I reduced all the things to the essence, as is typical in physics. And I examined the dynamics of things, and I just looked for some sort of driving force, something that's deeper, that's behind the things. And I just did not find such a force. There's nothing like this. What we find is the world itself. And the world functions out of its own force, but there's nothing deeper than that. So let's understand this. Now, we know the universe, it's basically all the universe is it's something that's filled with just objects and masses and energies and all these sort of particles and planets and stars and all these sorts of things, and they have some properties, and they have some dynamics, some way of being, of changing, of developing, and amongst each other they have some different types of interactions, which we try to describe when we are developing physical theories. Theories in physics. So the story here is very much so that the world, all there is out in the world, it's just that the world is this chaining of an object to an object, an interaction to an interaction, probability to interact with a probability, and just some sort of dynamic together with another dynamic, creating a new dynamic, right? So that's all there is. You have this long chain, this long concatenation of all these sorts of interactions and objects and everything that then comes as a consequence of that. And in this concatenation, then macroscopic behaviors can arise in, I wrote down here, the conglomerate of the mass of these objects. And so those macroscopic behaviors emerge from the interaction of the smaller object inside of this system. And there is no deeper truth than exactly that dynamic. So it's just that's literally it. That's just it. You have all these objects, they interact in some way, and then on a higher more abstract level, we can then find some sort of macroscopic behavior. All right, but there's nothing more than that. Now, just to ask why and try to explain the story a bit deeper. Now, physics has not found all of the truth of the world. There are still open questions. So certainly this view and everything that I'm explaining right now, this could change with the expansion of our knowledge. But judging from what we know right now, we sort of understand to some degree how things work on a small scale. You have these atoms, you have these bosons, some people think we have strings, they interact, you have molecules, they interact, you have masses, you have objects, and so on. But yeah, on the small scale, there's no magic there, right? You just have an atom, which is basically a proton and neutron. You have some electrons which swirl around that interact with other atoms, right? So there's no magic there. And when you combine those small objects into a larger and more complex interaction, that leads to emergent macroscopic phenomena. And yes, as I said, on the smallest level, you have bosons and strings, so you have these atoms and molecules, and they have some sort of kinetic interaction, and they seem to move sort of in a random, complex way, which is called Brownian motion. And then if you put a bunch of gas molecules together, you have a gas. So you have just one atom or one molecule. Now you put a bunch of molecules together. Now suddenly you have a gas, or you have a liquid, and suddenly those kinetic energy, meaning just meaning a molecule moving this direction, another one moving this direction, another one in this direction, and they might bounce off of each other. If you take this as one system and you look at the system from a macroscopic view, we can now say, okay, temperature is an emergent property of the agglomeration of the individual kinetic energies of the small objects inside of the system. Now, in the same way, molecules build together and form proteins in biological biological living beings. Okay, and they float around in some sort of liquid usually, and then proteins, they interact with each other and with other objects if they just so happen to collide with each other. There's nothing that really determines is this going to collide or not. It's just this might be moving this way, this might be moving this way, so it bumps into each other, and then there are some physical laws and some chemistry. In chemistry, it's just sort of an emergent dynamics from the underlying physical laws. Some sort of laws and interactions and dynamics that just then means some sort of consequences arise from them bumping into each other and interacting in some way. And through this way, more complex structures of proteins and molecules form into, for example, a cell. And this cell then usually has a sort of control mechanism, because through evolutionary pressure, cells that didn't have a control mechanisms used to dissolve and die. So all the cells we have today are those which can control themselves and become remain stable. So proteins just happen to combine in such a way that they form these cells, which happen to have emergent control mechanisms. But there's no magic in this whole process. There's no magic. There's no magician from the outside that says, okay, I have 2 molecules and 3 proteins, and there's no magic here, but when you combine them, now I'm gonna add some magic in there. No, it's just whatever happens when they interact, right? There's no magic behind this dynamics, which we know and which we understand. And right, so this chain of complexity from the bosons to the protons and electrons, to molecules, to proteins, to cells, to whole organisms, this chain of complexity, it just continues to build up, and it forms organs, and it forms human beings. It forms us. In this gaining of further complexity, at no point in this process is any sort of deeper meaning added into the process. There's just no meaning that just comes into it. It's nothing other than all of these things interacting in some interesting, arguably complex way, and then it forms whatever it happens to form. But there's nothing beyond that, right? So as I said, these dynamics, which you can see on a macroscopic level, they are called emergent phenomena, because they emerge from the smaller things which are in a conceptually lower level. Okay, in the same way that temperature arises when you have a bunch of gas molecules bouncing off of each other. And this also means that no human being has any sort of life force or soul or something like that goes beyond the status of being a simple or complex, but basically it's just It's an emergent phenomenon that exactly emerges through the interaction of, let's say, all our human organs. And the organs themselves are a system which has emergent self-control mechanisms, and it is made up of cells and cell organelles and proteins and molecules and so on. But there's nothing beyond that. That's what it means that it's only physical. It's just literally just physics. And this means, as I said, that no human being has actually sort of a soul or a psyche or a consciousness that goes beyond the status of being an emergent phenomena of purely physical processes. Yeah. Now, as I said, what I'm explaining here is not really an argument. It's tautological, because I am presuming that physicalism is the worldview, and I gave some arguments why this makes sense. So all of these consequences I just laid out now, they were already baked into the physical assumptions which we made. But still, I feel like it's fruitful, and to lay this out, and I also think physicalism is well justified, as I said. And by the way, this point I had in the last lecture about this: we exist inside the story the brain tells itself. This is a deeply physicalist explanation. So just if you want to revisit that, this emerges also from physicalism. So this means that though the world is incredibly interesting, and you can look out into the universe, and you can wonder at the stars and the galaxies and all of these systems, and you can wonder, wow, that's insane. Like, how did Earth develop, and how did life on Earth develop, which I will go on to shortly. But all the world is this deeply consequential, what I call endless sequence of interactions, of the chaining of one object to another, one interaction to another, one probability to another, one dynamic latches onto another dynamic, creating a new dynamic. So the whole world is just like this endless sequence and everything that emerges from that. But there's nothing, that's what it is, and it's interesting and it's good to understand. But it's not that there's something special, something fundamental behind all of that. There's nothing beyond that. We can understand how it works, and if we don't understand it, it might seem magical. But through the process of science, we have been slowly encroaching on all the things we don't understand yet. And the more we understand it, the more also, by the way, the physicalist pre-assumption is validated. Because certainly, relatively speaking, it seems to produce way better explanations than other pre-assumptions. And sort of the tragedy here is that you look out into the universe and there's actually nothing special in terms of a foundational truth which you could latch onto going on, beside what I just explained. So the world is empty of this sort of foundational truth which we were seeking, which we tried to find, but we didn't find it. It's not there. So we cannot use a physical understanding of the world as the sort of anchor for our life, for our psyche, for our worldview. Now this next point, also just something that follows from physicalism, but just let's go quickly through it. Is there some sort of foundational truth in the origins of life and of humanity, of how we as humans developed? Through basically the process of evolution. So here on the right side is this graph. This is the evolutionary tree, and it started out some 3.7 billion years ago, thereabouts, with simple life forms, bacteria. And by the way, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and 3.7 billion years ago, the first life emerged. So relatively speaking, quite early in the whole life cycle of Earth. And also imagine, like, in the first couple million years, Earth was just this hot ball of lava, so there couldn't conceivably uh, be any life there, I guess. So life first emerged in form of replicating RNA. So RNA is something similar to DNA, and the reason this is the first form of life is because this is the first true replicator that keeps itself alive in some way by being able to reproduce itself up to some approximation faithfully. And that's what we call life, basically. And these simple dynamics of replicators and then the environmental pressures they were under, so they were in this primordial, I can't say this word, ocean, and that, so this means they were in some sort of environment and there were some sort of conditions, and that serves as an environmental pressure that gives a sort of evolutionary direction. And then variation in the genes, variation in this sort of RNA or DNA, then led to a variation in phenotype, meaning basically how the animals or the cells or the bacteria look and work and so on. And this, over the span of billions of years, led to this huge universe of living things which we have today. And interestingly also, the living things themselves change their environment, creating ecosystem, and this then again changed the environmental pressures, which then again influenced the evolutionary process. So you have this recursivity also, this feedback dynamic in, or recursive nature of reality, as I say here, in the evolutionary process, right? So just to quickly say this, here in this picture we can roughly see that at first bacteria emerged, as I said, 3.7 billion years ago, and then you have these rings here, and you see global ice age, Cambrian explosion, mass extinction, mass extinction, mass extinction, mass extinction. So life on Earth went through these multiple cycles of being for a long time in a sort of a semi-stable environment, some sort of equilibrium, and evolution in that during those portions of history was sort of iterative, or might even be sort of stagnant, as far as the environment was static and stable. But then sometimes it was pierced by these brutal mass extinction events, where like 95% of living organisms were just wiped out, were just killed off. And interestingly enough, like this killing off actually meant then there was this huge new space for even more complex, even more plentiful, even more diverse life to develop. So it's sort of this step function development of evolution and of life on Earth. And at some point, apparently 225 million years ago, mammals emerged. So that's this branch here. And then 85 million years ago, monkeys emerged. And from monkeys, then 25 million years ago, apes, or it's called Hominoidea, emerged. And from them, then 6 million years ago, hominoids, or sort of human-like animals, emerged. So you might know like Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, and also us, Homo sapiens. And we emerged 300,000 years ago as the modern humans of today. That's us, that's we, right? So we are on this planet, or something that's similar like us, or it's pretty much so as we are today, emerged merely 300,000 years ago, and life emerged 3.7 billion years ago. Okay, so insane. And but we are one of the products of this complex process and of this evolutionary tree. That's the understanding we have today in modern science. backed by our presupposition, which I think is well established, of physicalism. So what can we glean from that? What can we glean from that? What can we learn from that? The evolutionary process, again, basically is just whatever happens when the molecules interact and they form some RNA, and then that RNA, which is a successful replicator, survives, and others which can't replicate themselves, they just die off. So whatever survives multiplies, and then there's variation, and then we slowly have bacteria, and then we at some point multicellular life emerges, and this at some point then merges, or let's say animals emerge from that, right? So it's just this process, and this process can influence itself, as I said, this recursive nature of reality, and that's how we evolved, right? But there's no more special, no more magic, nothing behind whatever that is, no special particular reason other than all the factors that happen to coincide in the perfect way, such that we emerged. There's no deep reason why those factors happen to coincide, other than they themselves emerged from whatever came beforehand, right? So there's nothing magic going on. It might seem magic, it's certainly insane how we evolved, but there's nothing there. There's just nothing there. It's just, as I said, it's a concatenation of interaction to interaction. And we now are animals. At least, let's say partly. I would say we're fully animals, but at least partly. We know, that's correct. We know we are animals. And we know in the state we are thrown in this sort of way of living. And this thrownness of us being humans, that's a topic I will come back to in a future lecture on existentialism. It's really an interesting and important point of existentialism. But the basic theme is we humans are animals. We are a product of evolution, and you were just born. You, as the person watching this, you were just born, and you can't help the fact that you were born. You can't help the fact that you are one of the consequences of this complex, multi-billion-year-old process of evolution. And before that, or the whole process of how the universe unfolded and how Earth developed. So you are just thrown into this. And this is really important and interesting. And I will be talking about this more in depth once I cover the topic of existentialism as a philosophically important topic. But the lesson we can take for now is there is no foundational truth in the history of our emergence as human beings. There's no foundational truth. There's no deep reason why you, as the viewer now, are sitting here and watching this. It's just the consequence of whatever happened to happen and happened to coincide and happened to interact, and whatever happens to be, we don't know why, happens to be the physical laws which the universe seems to have, right? And even though we can perfectly, or at least up to some approximation, explain why and how we and how you individually came to life and came to be living, this does not tell us anything that we could actually hold on to, right? The history of humans as an evolutionary animal in a physical world is interesting, but it's nothing stable. You cannot build your psyche on top of this. This doesn't orient your life. It just doesn't do it. It just doesn't do the job we need it to do, or we would need it to do. So we find no anchor in the history of humanity's emergence and in sort of the reason why we individually are alive. It's basically random. So, sounds depressing, right? Sounds depressing, right? And it might be depressing. Because inevitably, the consequence we have to draw from this is this German sentence where I say, Der Mensch findet fundamental keinen Halt im Leben. Which means, translated, something like, humans fundamentally have nothing to hold on to in life. Okay, so are you depressed yet? Humans fundamentally have nothing to hold on to in life. We looked in religion and we looked into the world. That's basically the central pieces of truth which we could consult, or basically the only conceivable sources of truth which we could consult. And we did consult them, and we did analyze it, and we had a look. And what did we find? What deep truth did we find? Nothing. Nothing. Neither in religion nor in the world around us can we find something solid to hold on to. Something solid that anchors us. Something that stabilizes us. Something that gives us direction. Something that can inform our decisions. Something that stabilizes our life and in such a way is the precondition to having a good life. Right. So, der Mensch findet fundamental keinen Halt im Leben. We find fundamentally we have no hold in life. Nothing to hold on to. And with fundamentally, I mean that there is nothing fundamental which we find. So nothing primal, nothing absolute basically, which can serve as this sort of basis for our life. Right. So just repeating, nothing stable to hold on to in this absolute way, which we would need. Because if it's not absolute, it's not stable. If it's not absolute, it's basically it's sand. It can be washed away, and that's what this fundamental analysis reveals. That sort of a psychological stability in an absolute sense is impossible. So it can never be guaranteed that you're psychologically stable. So it can also not be guaranteed that you have a good life. So in an absolute sense, a good life is not possible. But in practice, in reality, if you observe actual humans, if you, we see that people find relatively strong anchors. They don't find absolute anchors. They find relatively strong anchors. Now, and in the final section now, I would like to explain, and this is now where tautologies and the way I define it here and use it, or let's say that that's the first true emergence of the term of tautology in this thought process. And the term tautology will take on a much more broad sense later on throughout the lecture. But next up, the tautology concept will emerge. And I want to explain how the practical, relatively strong anchors people tend to find always seem to turn out to be some form of tautology. And why the realization of this fact puts us into a seemingly unsolvable situation. Right. Okay, so this will come in the next chapter now, which I will go into shortly. And in the future lectures, I will be then developing and talking about the existential realities of us living as human beings. For example, the fact of being thrown into life, and how we can, seeing that that's the life we find ourselves in, that's the sort of circumstance we find ourselves into, and we can't help the fact that we are existing human beings right now, and that's just how the world happens to be, as far as we can tell. How in this circumstance we can build a tautology, what I call a tautology, that provides the best possible anchoring, not an absolute, not a perfect, not a fundamental, like undestroyable, but the best possible, the best thing that we could do given the circumstances, the best possible anchoring and stability and direction for a good life, right? So we have to come to terms that there is fundamentally nothing to hold on to in life, but also we can be we can find solace in the fact that we do observe people finding some sort of stability, and we can analyze that and we can understand it, and then we can develop for ourselves what I call a tautology, which is the best possible out of all the options way of finding this psychological stability and this direction in life, which then means that's our best possible chance of having a good life, which is what it's all about. So let's jump into that, shall we? Now, when analyzing existing worldviews, when I went out and analyzed existing worldviews of people, I came to realize that ultimately they are all based on each of their own, but they are all based on tautologies respectively. Each might have different tautologies, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to a tautology, something that proves itself. Remember, a tautology is a sentence that proves itself. Because tautologies are where this endless downward spiral of asking why, tautologies are where asking why comes to a halt. Because a tautology proves itself. There is no more asking why once you arrive at a tautology. So at the very bottom, and wherever this bottom might be, and it's deep down, but at the very bottom of this spiral of whys lies a tautology. And for I would say all human beings with a stable worldview and sort of that manage to anchor, relatively speaking, their worldview and their stability is underlied and is foundationalized, let's say, by some type of tautology, or some sort of hybrid form of tautology, which I will go into now. Now, historically, the most potent and the deepest and the most absolute and strongest tautology human beings had, historically speaking, is the tautology that says God is God. Now, see, this is this is sort of maybe the weird reality, the weird fact about the tautology, that it seems too simple. It seems sort of stupid. It seems too trivial just to say God is God, and now that's the answer. It's not really an answer, but at the end of the day, historically speaking, that's what grounded people, and that's what kept people stable, and that's what kept culture stable. And this has been a valid tautology for hundreds of years in Europe. So certainly I'm Eurocentric or Western-centric, but in general I think this is the concept of tautology is applicable cross-culturally. But certainly I can't help but have a European perspective on that, just by virtue of having grown up in the Western world. And yeah, so this has been a valid tautology for literally millennia. And it's deep, and it's stable, and it's so foundational, and it can serve as a well-functioning anchor. Because this concept of God, whatever form it might take, and of course there are all these sorts of interpretations, but the concept of God is absolute. And it's absolute to such a degree that God itself is tautological. Because you can ask many, many times why? Why are things the way they are? Why should I do this and this and this? But if deeply inside of your psyche you believe in this tautology, or you believe in God, meaning then you believe in the tautology of God is God, at some point in your spiral of asking why, you will then arrive at this point of saying, that's because God is God. That will be your final answer. And there's no further asking why at that point. Because God is this absolute all-encompassing thing, usually, and thus serves as a strong inner core of this outer worldview and belief system and direction and heuristic of living your life and stabilizing your psyche. And there's no undermining this foundational core tautology. And that's why, actually, historically speaking, the tautology of God, or God being God, was extremely successful, psychologically speaking, just so sociologically speaking, right? So human beings built successful cultures, meaning cultures that didn't collapse on themselves or that hold on for a long time, and human beings that didn't succumb to crises of meaning, on top of tautologies which took these sorts of forms. And particularly in the West, and this could also be in different pieces, but particularly in the West, God, which mostly informed by the Abrahamistic conception of God, has been focused in this sort of single entity which we anthropomorphize. So we feel like God is sort of, I don't know, maybe similar like a human, or we might imagine like this daddy in the sky or whatever, God as the man in the sky. And especially like this conception of God makes, I believe, I would argue, for an even stronger tautology than a more of a diffused understanding of God being just like the divine spirit in nature, because it being so particularly focused inside of a form which we can understand since it's anthropomorphized, so meaning it has human shape, human form, it means we can more easily relate to it, and it just helps us anchor ourselves in our beliefs and actions and feelings inside or in this core tautology. Core tautology, I mean core tautology because it's at the core, it's at the center of your overarching worldview and also your psyche and all these things. So historically speaking, God is God. That's the potent tautology, and I suspect that many people's worldviews, since they are just adopted from general culture, people grow up and they are infused with the culture around them, and they just generally take on whatever beliefs and views are present in the culture around them. And that's why, since these sorts of tautologies, especially the God tautology, has been in the culture for millennia, I think it stands to reason, and also if you investigate this, I think it's reasonable, I think, to deduce this, that then most people's worldviews can at least partially be deduced back to such a relatively deep, strong, foundational tautology. And now, this doesn't mean that people themselves are aware that whatever their worldview is based on such a deep tautology. But they don't need to be aware for the tautology to quote-unquote work in that it stabilizes them psychologically. And actually, the reality is that consciously, most people effectively stop at sort of a shallow, ignorant, everyday tautology, like it's just how it is. That's how it is. Meaning, they might be asking themselves why 2 or 3 times, but they just remain in the outer crust of this deep sort of earth. If you imagine like their whole worldview is this earth, and at the very core there might be, hopefully, I mean if they're stable, arguably there is a deep foundational tautology, but people never drill down that deep. They never come to realize, okay, some might, but in general, they don't put the effort in and are usually ignorant in never actually finding that all their view is placed on this tautology. So they stop in the outer crust, in the outer layers, and just basically stop. They stop asking why. At some point, they just say, I don't care, it's what it is. That's what it is. Let's just be ignorant from this point forward. And of course, that's suboptimal, right? Because if you stop asking why, you are necessarily on unstable ground, because you don't know. You just don't know. So they sort of deny the need to ask deeper, and thus they deny the possibility of greater depth. And this is usually, I suspect, and I think it's true, this usually sort of a psychological maneuver to shield themselves. So basically, they stop asking why at some point. They say, I don't want to know. It's what it is. Leave me alone. And that's actually just a psychological maneuver to shield themselves, to defend themselves from the fear which they have instinctively, subconsciously, of the instability that might arise if they exposed actually their beliefs and their thoughts and their feelings and their goals by asking why further and going deeper, if they just dare to probe their beliefs further. So instinctively, they know they are not on solid ground. They know if I ask why, if I go too deep, I might find out all of what I believe is based on sand. It's just unstable. It is unfounded. There's no foundation. There's no real reason to it. It's just whatever I happen to believe. That's what I meant in the beginning. It's just whatever the arbitrary process was that led me to believe this. There's nothing beyond that for the deeper reason of why I believe it. So instinctively they know it's dangerous to ask why. So they just prefer to deny. They just prefer to shield themselves and say it's what it is. So basically they accept the shallow tautology of saying that's what it is. It's what it is. Leave me alone. And they are right to be fearful, because it's true. Like if you ask why, chances are whatever you happen to believe falls apart, because you realize it's unsubstantiated. It's based on nothing. And in that way, we know analysis is corrosive and can be subversive. Generally, I would say it's subversive. And also here, I like this Nietzsche quote, which is sort of related, where he says, if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. So if you just go deeper, you might basically fall into mental disrepair, right? But of course, we know there's no alternative to doing this analysis. There's no alternative to asking why if you want to live a good life, because stability is essential for the good life. So you need to find stable ground. You need to find something stable. You need to find halt. You need to find an anchor. So thus, the analysis is necessary, even though it's corrosive. The self-corrosive analysis is necessary because it's productive, because you learn something, and because this will then start a process of then, I would argue, and I will teach you, developing your tautology, which through a specific reason, which I will then outline, will actually be as stable as you can get. And I would say it will be basically absolutely stable. Not absolutely, because nothing is absolute, because fundamentally we cannot find something to hold on to. But relatively speaking, it will be the most stable you could get. So yeah. So because of what I just said, my observation is that in practice, people tend to have these hybrid sort of tautological worldviews, where they clamor incessantly to their shallow tautology in everyday life, where they just say, leave me alone, that's what it is, this is the truth, don't ask any further questions, because they are scared to ask any further questions. Because asking more questions might show that, okay, bro, it's just not correct. It's just substantiated. It's just unfounded what you're believing in. All right? It's untrue. You're incorrect. You made a mistake. You are not stable. So they clamor, and that's also people with the shallowest tautologies, with the shallowest beliefs, who are most fearful of asking why, instinctively know they are on unstable ground, which is why they are so crazy in holding on to these surface level beliefs. And so you see there's a direct proportionality between people um, being desperate in how strong they hold on to it, and how unstable it is fundamentally. Because if it would be stable, they wouldn't have to hold on for dear life, because it's stable. They can rest, they can be assured. And so this is one piece of the puzzle, and the other piece of the hybrid tautological worldview is that the surface level beliefs people have generally are informed from general culture. And general culture, as I said, developed out of this deep history of human anthropology and cultural development. And there's even sort of this evolutionary I don't know if I... Yeah, exactly. There's even this sort of evolutionary argument to those cultures and those beliefs and those deep worldviews or religions or whatever, that amongst other tasks and functions religions play, those that provided the most foundational, the strongest psychological anchoring, they tended to outproduce, to overproduce, and to survive. And other less strong tautologies, which are at the core of all different types of religions in human history, they tended to fall by the wayside. So, just to go back to this quick point, people consciously believe in shallow tautologies, but the beliefs they hold are informed by the history of human culture, and generally they at their core do have strong and good and foundational tautologies like the God tautology. So generally people have a decent stability just by osmosis of general culturally available tautologies. And yes, certainly I think it's a fair argument to make that one of the evolutionary pressures that led to some religions winning out over others, although of course there are multiple other factors involved. One of the reasons why some might be more adaptable than the others are because they are actually functionally better in providing psychological stability to the believers. So generally speaking, that's why the God tautology, which reproduced like crazy, that's why it's everywhere in the world, the God tautology is incredibly strong. It's awesome, if you can believe it. That's the issue. But yeah, it's incredibly strong, and people shallowly hold beliefs which are deeply informed by the tautology. So in general, it's decent. And I just want to point this out. If you find this sort of interesting, this sort of development of myths and philosophies and human psychology, go ahead and take your time in reading Eric Neumann's book called Origins and History of Consciousness, which I found to be really, really insightful, really interesting. But you have to be patient and diligent while reading because it's quite dense and it's not easy to understand, but I think it's quite fruitful. But putting that aside, we now know that in general people's worldviews can be reduced and are placed upon these deep tautologies. So that's how tautologies arise. Okay, now let's get into the next point, which is the point of, and it's quite quickly, but tautologies, the point of tautologies being self-stabilizing. Now, why are they self-stabilizing? It's because once you believe in them, whatever the process that you came to believe it, maybe you were taught them early on and you sort of fell into believing them, but once you believe the tautology, it just works. It just is stable. It stabilizes itself because the very nature of the tautology is that it proves itself. So, meaning, once you're inside of that loop, once you take one piece of the statement as correct, however you got to that position, it will prove the other pieces. So once you believe in God, it's stable, it's good. And also, this now harks back to the last lecture on perception, is that once you believe that, once you accept that, this then now is a central piece of your generative world model in your brain, and this will then shape your perception. So the perception, how you perceive the world, how you then view the world, will be shaped by your presupposition, by your belief in the tautology, and then this will then result in you see in the world all the time proof of exactly this tautology. And in that way, it's also, as the second point, stabilizing. Above and beyond, it's just being a tautology in and of itself, being self-proving, which is the definition of a tautology, but also due to the deep connection of the worldview, which and the tautology being central to the worldview, and how the worldview is employed by your brain to form human perception. Once you believe it, you cannot help but view the world in any other way other than such that your worldview is, or your tautology is proven. And in that way, it's stabilizing. And that's a great property of these sort of tautologies in the way I define them. And now, earlier I mentioned, with this realization, we will run into an issue. And now let's discuss this issue. Because I myself kept asking why, right? What I suggest you to do with this asking why and probing your own beliefs in your thoughts and everything like that, I did it on my own. I did it for myself. I kept asking why. And at some point, I found myself at the very bottom of that tree of whys. And right there, then I and just to say, I not only ask why about myself, but by proxy, I looked at other people's worldviews as well and tried asking why for them, just to see, okay, to what core does their worldview reduce? And via this process, I then came to this realization of, okay, basically, it's reduced into some tautology. But now imagine, like, we on the outside, all of these layers of beliefs and the worldviews we see superficially, people believe this or that. And then we ask why, we dig down, we drill down, and now we're in the middle and we find all of these tautologies. So now we're at the very bottom layer of asking why. And the issue now is, I myself don't already believe some sort of tautology. I'm not religious, for example. And if I happen to be religious, I wouldn't have needed to ask why. I probably should have asked why, just to find out. But I wouldn't really have needed, because I would be already stable in the pre-existing tautology given by the religious belief. But since I don't have that, now I find myself in a position, and you guys are now with me down here, in the bottom layer of asking why, where we find all of these different tautologies, right? And so different people might have different tautologies. So now we might ask ourselves, okay, apparently we need some sort of tautology to be stable, but how can we choose? We see, like, we have all of these tautologies. How should we now choose between them, amongst them? And the issue with being on the very bottom layer, meaning there's no more asking why, because we are the bottom layer. Anything that's left is tautologies, and you cannot ask further why beyond the tautologies, because the tautologies are the end of the downward spiral of asking why. So, being in that situation, if we don't intrinsically already believe a tautology, there is no basis for us on which to choose one of the tautologies. Why? Because to choose means you first need to define some sort of metric or yardstick, I said earlier. And then you have to use this metric to measure the options, basically to compare the options. And then you can choose the best option according to the metric. But how do you find a metric to make a decision? You find the metric by asking why. You find the metric by asking, okay, why do I want to choose? What am I trying to pursue in this choice? why do I want to make this decision? You need to ask why to find out what you want to achieve in this choice between some range of options. And since we're already on the bottom layer of asking why, there is no more asking why. So there's no way to find a metric, and thus there's also no way to make a decision amongst all of these tautologies which we find there. And in 2020, I came to this realization that we are basically, or back then I was basically stuck, that I found that we want to live a good life. To have a good life, we need to find stability, psychological stability. We need to find some sort of anchor, some sort of halt, which gives us a direction, heuristic, and so on. And I analyzed, I asked why, and I drilled down all the way, and I came to this point, okay, all of these worldviews which help people find stability, they are all based on tautologies, respectively. But now, understanding this, realizing this, I'm stuck. I'm stuck. Because I don't already believe some of these tautologies, and I cannot choose amongst them because it's totally arbitrary. There's no way to choose. There's no way to make a choice. So I was stuck. And that was my realization back then. And since then, I've also found two interesting quotes, which I think are related. And I feel like sort of justify also now in hindsight that these sort of insights were at least partially correct. And the first quote is by this philosopher called Hubert Dreyfus. There's this video, interestingly, from it's an interview on existentialism and philosophy. I will link the video in the description. And he said about Sartre, Sartre thinks when you try to choose your actions deliberately, meaning you ask, why do I do this? Basically, choosing your actions deliberately means you need to investigate. Why are you taking this action, not the other one? That means doing it deliberately instead of just doing arbitrarily, just doing, okay, I feel like doing this, so I'm just gonna do it and I'm not gonna ask why. So if you try to choose it deliberately, this will break down into a kind of absurdity. Absurdity is an important point in French existentialism, into the kind of absurdity that Sartre sees. Because if you try to choose everything, you will find out that what you choose is completely arbitrary. Because there's no basis on which to choose anything, because the basis is always up for choice too. And it's a choice from nowhere. Okay, why is this exactly the thing I'm talking about? Is because whatever your actions are, they are based in some worldview, they are according to some worldview, some heuristic, and those are based in some tautology. But if you don't already hold a tautology, you would need to choose between a tautology. But since tautology is the bottom layer, this would be a choice from nowhere. You have no basis upon which you can do this choice. So there's no way to, in this telling, there's no way to do your actions deliberately, because you will realize it's completely arbitrary. The same way it would be arbitrary to say, all right, you know what? I have no idea why. I'll just pick this tautology and I'll leave all these other ones by the wayside. For whatever reason, I will pick whatever tautology is the bottom of Buddhism, or at the bottom of Judaism, or at the bottom of Christianity, or whatever else. Or it doesn't have to be a religion particularly, it could be some other thing. But it would be completely arbitrary. There's no way, it would be a choice from nowhere for me to just say, I will pick this tautology. Right, so again, we're stuck. Also David Deutsch, I mentioned him in the last lecture because I like him very much. Really insightful guy. And in this great video called David Deutsch Explains Why It's Good to Be Wrong, again, I'll link the video, he says, there can't be an ultimate foundation, because if there were an ultimate foundation, the question of why is that the ultimate foundation rather than some other thing would never be answerable. So that again is sort of maybe not perfectly, but I think it's still related towards this issue of if you have the bottom layer, the most foundational thing, it's unjustifiable why you pick this one and not the other one, because you're already at the foundation, and you would need something by mere nature of how things are. You would need something more foundational that would explain why you picked this one and not the other one. But if it's already the most foundational thing, it's unjustified. It's arbitrary. It's a choice from nowhere. We are stuck. We're stuck. Right. So, we are stuck, right? And the thing is now, and this is what the next lectures will then be about, if we cannot choose a tautology, we can certainly birth one out of ourselves. That's at least my claim. We cannot choose a tautology, but we can birth one out of ourselves via the process of self-observation and understanding of our existential reality. And all of this I will develop in future lectures. So, thanks for listening. I will now make a quick summary of this. Now, today we learned that humans fundamentally cannot find an anchor that is absolute in life, neither through religion nor through our understanding of the physical universe and of human evolution. We find no foundational truth in them, and thus they are what I call empty. It's the emptiness of the physical universe and of human religions. Now, when analyzing why some people seem to find stability in their worldviews, in their belief systems, we find that they all inevitably tend to anchor themselves, or the anchor seems to be a tautology, which is at the core of this belief system, and this exact tautology keeps them stable and is the backstop of our asking why. Okay, that's at the bottom, that's at the core. And it seems that in practice people are not aware of this sort of latent or subconscious or whatever tautologies they believe in, because the deeper tautologies they believe in, they were diffused and taken on through culture. And the reason why they're in culture is maybe some evolutionary argument, but inevitably it's in the culture and people take this up. But consciously people tend to stick to shallow tautology, saying that is what it is, stop asking why, and they clamor onto the shallow tautologies because they know if they were to ask why, it would all break apart. And this grasping onto shallow tautologies, it just amounts to mere ignorance. And it is unstable. Now, having understood the nature of worldviews resting on tautologies, we are faced with a problem that there's no way of making a choice between all these tautologies which we could observe in the world or in other human beings. So that's an issue, and that's something we have to solve. And in practice, we do find people find stability, meaning, and direction in life. And I think the way to in the end have a tautology and gain all of these psychological benefits and basically place a good life, have a good life on top of a tautology which is your own, is to develop it yourself, birth it from yourself basically. And the development of a apt and fitting tautology for yourself, and how it is grounded in a process of self-observation and self-understanding, ultimately also self-acceptance, self-love, and also a understanding of the existential reality of our human life. All of this I will discuss in future lectures. So with that, I hope you understood roughly what I meant with the emptiness and what I meant with how tautologies seem to work and how they come about and how they serve as anchors and why this anchoring is so crucial, why human beings need Halt, what I say Halt in German, something to hold on to in life, to have a stable life, on top of which we can build a good life, which is the ultimate goal. So thank you for your time, thank you for listening. And if you like the lecture, please consider giving a thumbs up and subscribing, and also clicking the bell icon so you're notified once I upload the next lecture. And the next lecture will be on the topic of systems thinking. This will be the last lecture that will establish some basic topics, on top of which we will then get into the further topics where we will then talk about the existential realities. But yeah, the next lecture will be on systems thinking and feedback loops and all these sorts of topics. And yeah, click the bell icon to be notified once I upload that next video. For now, thank you for watching, and until the next time, bye bye.